Hi folks, we're just given a few moments here at the top for Zoom to let everybody in before we get started with tonight's event. If you are already in tonight's event with us, you can open up your chat window and find some information about how to purchase books by tonight's featured authors. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Chelsea from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Rachel Kushner presenting her new book, The Hard Crowd. She'll be talking with Hari Kunzru, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Rachel, Hari, and the team at Scribner for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make this space for conversation and connection. Now I have just a few housekeeping things. First, in our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of your fellow attendees at the top of your Zoom screen. There are a couple of different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with your fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And if you open up the Q&A module and see a question from another attendee that you would really like to have answered, you can upvote that so that it goes to the top of the Q&A queue. And importantly, tonight's featured book, The Hard Crowd, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations, noon to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Rachel's book and many others on site. Or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. You can find that by link in the chat. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer tonight is Hari Kunzru. He is the author of 6 novels, including Gods Without Men, White Tears, and Red Pill. He's a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books and writes the Easy Chair column for Harper's. He's an honorary fellow of Wadham College, Oxford, a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and has been a Coleman Fellow at the New York Public Library, a Guggenheim Fellow, and a Fellow of the American Academy in Berlin. He teaches in the creative writing program at New York University and is the host of the podcast Into the Zone from Pushkin Industries. He'll be speaking with our featured author, Rachel Kushner. She is the best-selling author of 3 novels, the Booker and NBCC Awards shortlisted Memoirs Room, The Flamethrowers, a finalist for the National Book Award and a New York Times Top 10 Book of 2013, and Telex from Cuba, a finalist for the National Book Award. Her new book, The Hard Crowd, is a career-spanning collection of spectacular essays about politics and culture. These pieces, new and old, are electric, phosphorescently vivid, and wry, and they provide an opportunity to witness the evolution and range of one of our most dazzling and fearless writers. Rachel is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then she'll be talking with Hari and with all of you. Rachel, please take it away.
Thanks very much, Chelsea. Thanks everybody for coming. Obviously, thanks to Hari. Hearing a all of his many laurels listed in the bio.
Establishment credentials.
Sorry?
Establishment credentials. Listed in.
Well, I was reminded in hearing about the podcast Into the Zone how feverishly I blasted through every episode when those went live. And I encourage everyone to listen to On the Zone. It is so great. In any case, and I've got Hari's book, Red Pill, right here, so behind me. I'm going to read from the title essay of this book, The Hard Crowd. And this part is about a bar that I worked at in San Francisco when I was young. It was my first bartending job. And it's called the Blue Lamp. And it was at the top of the Tenderloin neighborhood in San Francisco. Yeah. Ari, do you want to mute while I'm reading? Because I can hear some furniture moving around. There he goes. Okay. The owner of the Blue Lamp was named Bobby. I remember his golf cap and his white boat shoes and the broken purple capillaries on his face. The gallery of sad young women who tolerated him in exchange for money and a place to crash. Bobby's brother would drive his Harley right into the bar. Bobby lived out in the Excelsior, but the two brothers built an apartment upstairs from the Blue Lamp for especially wild nights. I never once went up there. It wasn't a place I wanted to see. Sometimes the swamper, Jer we all called him, slept up there when he knew Bobby wasn't coming around, but mostly Jer slept in the bar's basement, on an old couch next to the syrup tanks. Jer's life philosophy was, we'll work for beer. He restocked the coolers, fetched buckets of ice, mopped up after hours, drank 40 bottles of Budweiser a day, and only resorted to harder stuff on his periodic Greyhound trips to Sparks to play slots. That Jer preferred Sparks to Reno was one of the only things about himself that he vocalized. In addition to slots, Jer played video poker. We had a machine in the bar called Hot Point that paid out to winners illegally in cash. Whole parts of Jer, I suspected, were missing, in some kind of permanent dormancy. I wondered who he'd been before he lived this repetitive existence of buckets of ice and Budweiser day after day after day. He owned nothing. He slept in his clothes, slept even in his mesh baseball hat. I know. I saw. He lived at the bar and never went out of character. He was a drinker and swamper. He said little, but it was him and me, night after night. A bartender and her bar back are a kind of platonic pair, and Jer had my back literally. After 2 a.m. closings, he would come outside and watch me start my motorcycle, an orange Moto Guzzi I parked on its center stand on the sidewalk. He insisted I call the bar when I got home. I always did. These Tenderloin bars were human puzzles. There was one up the street that had a double bed in the back where a man lay all day like it was his hospice. You'd be playing pool and drinking with your friends, and there was this man in bed behind a rubber curtain. Even the names of these establishments, all part of an invisible Tenderloin circuit, evoke for me this half-lit world. Cinnabar, the Driftwood, Jonelle's. I remember a man, youngish and well-dressed, who would come into the Blue Lamp and act crazy on my shifts. Once he came in threatening to kill himself. I said, go ahead, but not in here. Did I really say that? I doubt it. I can't remember what I said. I never wrote about most of the people from the Blue Lamp. If I transformed them into fiction, I might lose my grasp on the real place, the evidence of which has otherwise evaporated. The bar is gone. All those people have died. That might be why. Or perhaps a person can write about things only when she is no longer the person who experienced them, and that transition is not yet complete. The person who writes about her experience is not the same person who had the experience. The ability to write about it is proof of change, of great distance. Not everyone is willing to admit this, but it's true. In this sense, a conversion narrative is built into every autobiography. The writer purports to be the one who remembers, who saw, who did, who felt. but the writer is no longer that person. In writing things down, she is reborn, and yet still defined by the actions she took, even if she now distances herself. In all a writer's supposed self exposure, her claim to authentic experience, the thing the writer omits reporting on is her galling idea that her life might become a subject put to paper, might fill the pages of a book.
Thank you for that. I have to do the clapping on behalf of
No.
everybody. Um, I know that is you've hit on a passage that I really love in that essay, and I mean one of the pleasures of the collection is that it is a little bit like getting to hang out with you. And I was sort of surprised. There you go. Someone's saying we're clapping remotely. Um, I was sort of surprised by the intimacy of it, and it's a way of writing that I find quite difficult. Did you find it difficult to kind of access that part of your past and your life? I mean, at the end there, you are framing it in quite a self-conscious way.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I mean, I don't know if I didn't quite feel self-conscious in the framing and more somewhat almost forensic in trying to figure out what confession is, and it's something I've thought about for a fairly long time. I've always had this sense that once you can write something down, all of your claims about what it is, if they're claims to authenticity, there's reason for suspicion because you can't basically I don't know if you can grab life by the horns and be totally and thoroughly rooted in the present tense, in the way that I would define that kind of, maybe rooting is the wrong description, but that kind of being completely in the moment and be a writer. It, they don't work simultaneously.
Mm.
You can be one and then the other maybe, and if somebody's trying to sort of hang on to the mythology of being one type while being the other, there's something that's calcified that they're not copping to. And I'm just interested in the whole experience for me as a writer of what it is I'm doing. If I over mythologize, then I miss out on part of the experience of what it means to write about your own life. When I went to write this essay that is the title essay of this book, The Hard Crowd, it was the last thing I did after putting the collection together. I ordered everything into this rhythm and how I wanted it to go, a kind of like passing the torch, essay to essay, so the reader would have a particular kind of experience. And I wanted it to really feel like a book, like page 1 to page 250. And then when I sat down to write this essay, it kind of, this is a cliche, but it's sort of, it was a deluge. It just ran like a river. And there were things that I wanted to say. And, as a writer yourself, maybe you can identify, I think that I hit the rhythm of how to do it in the piece. To go back and forth between allowing myself to have this kind of romantic jag about the past and then looking at it in a somewhat harsher light and then trying to figure out how the whole thing worked together and maybe reinformed all the other pieces in the book. So it was meant to be a final statement, and I wrote it as a final statement to these essays.
It's a great essay, and I mean, I suppose you can really feel that in the book is there's plenty of material that a lot of writers would romanticize or would indulge themselves with this kind of picture of themselves that was would put their thumb on the scales in some way, but there's always this sense that you are interested in calibrating it in some way because how should I put this? There's a lot of things in there that seem to have to do with cool in that kind of cultural form of cool, things that could be presented as cool. But cool is such a problem for a writer and is such a sort of trap, I think, in a way. Like, and how could you say some more about how you navigate that kind of a certain sort of self presentation and a certain dialogue with things? You're talking about fast motorbikes and drugs and kind of various sort of edgy experiences. Like how do you deal with the relationship to the tradition, especially in San Francisco, of that?
Yeah, God, it's such a good question. So, a few thoughts. First, about kind of writers putting their thumb on the scale, maybe to like up the cool quotient. I think that there's also the danger in putting your thumb on the scale in insisting that you're the only one who is more honest and rigorous and more, um, more self-examining than self-mythologizing. Um, so I guess it's just, you know what I mean? I'm trying to look into how to navigate a line that doesn't position myself as coming out looking a certain way that puts me in some space of whether it's moral clarity or moral superiority or the one who really did this or that. I don't know. But I have a few thoughts about the cool thing. Well, first, I mean, I think one of the reasons it kind of comes up in the literary world is because it's an incredibly dorky, uncool world. Um, I know, but
True. This is totally true. Yeah.
um, and so the idea of what's cool, like people can latch onto that kind of quickly. And the danger in running with it, if you're the one that people are finding maybe like a little bit cool, is that it's kind of uncool to play that role, and to perform it. And also, some of the truth gets dispensed with in that, because we're all such a mix of things. Like with this book, there's a lot of, I didn't choose this cover. I've come to accept it. My editor really wanted to have the picture of me in front of my 64 Ford on the cover.
It's
And
a cool
and
cover.
well, I put this epigraph with the book. I'm going to read it. I should have it memorized, but I'm a little nervous, so that's dropped out. What others get from me is then reflected back onto me and forms the atmosphere called I, which is Clarice Lispector, but in a way it was me kind of deflecting the cover and reminding myself and maybe everybody else in a moment of, I hope, sort of more quiet self exposure that I do incorporate in a certain way and then reproject what it is other people might see in me. But maybe the object is to keep moving and keep doing that in a more complicated way. And like when you write a book that includes essays about, illegal road race, motorcycle road race, and people like the legendary Freddie Corbin, who, your wife Katie's brother knows. He's a kind of celebrity tattoo artist from San Francisco. And having moved through these milieu of more cool subcultures, there's also another me. And I was talking to my husband the other day, and he said, you know, where's the you that read Willa Cather as a child or read Steinbeck as a child? And so we're all made of these contradictory forces. And I think it's just important not to get remade into your own avatar when you're performing this odd role of being the author.
I mean, the cover is, it's clearly a construction, and it's a self-conscious cover in a certain way. But I mean, and moving off the idea of cool, I'm gonna quote back to you something you wrote about Dennis Johnson. Uh, it feels like the paced vision of a writer who's been made to understand that life is fairly rude and somewhat short, but the world contains an uneven distribution of grace, and wisdom lies in recognizing where such grace, tend itself. And that idea of grace, and this idea of of it being found in a slightly unexpected way, and the attempt to recognize it, that seems a much more emotionally present kind of thing, and cool and self-presentation and all that register. And that's definitely, I feel, part of your project with this. I mean, so maybe you could say something about Grace, and maybe say something about Dennis Johnson, who's a writer I hadn't thought about reading again for a long time, and now your essay made me want to go back to Dennis Johnson and look at him again.
Yeah, I love this question about Grace. By the way, I held up the book while you were talking because
Yeah.
somebody in the chat said, "Can I please see the cover so I know what you're talking about?" It was a weird thing to do when you're talking about Grace. Like, this is not an example of Grace. It's it's not ungraceful, but it's something else altogether. Yeah, Dennis Johnson is a great writer. I mean, Angels is always worth revisiting, I think, and that novel is constructed in such a sort of um, dense, poetic way. You are reminded that he's a poet first and foremost when you're reading it. Um, and he's a kind of he's a useful swerve maybe from the territory of cool because he had a following in the 90s that sort of held him up as a very particular kind of cool, and it was among people, at least in my milieu, who didn't really read a whole lot of other authors. Like Dennis Johnson, Jesus' Son was a book that was read by people who lived lives that were not unlike the characters that feature in those stories. Um, that said, I think that Dennis Johnson, as I say in that essay, was only incidentally somebody who'd lived a very hard life and got kind of caught up in drugs and alcohol, um, and instead was defined by um, a kind of moral seriousness. I mean, he became a Christian. I don't really know of what type. He was pretty private, I believe, about his religious leanings. But, grace, maybe if I had to define something about it, is about how seriously you take yourself and other people. And in terms of writing about one's own life in a format like this, essays, nonfiction, it's no longer under the guise and a kind of in the sort of mythical envelope of fiction. You're trying to sort and categorize. I think for me, grace has to do with honestly having moved into a more reflective stage of life. Um, I'm older now, and I can feel certain key differences that really interest me, that I'm kind of excited by, to be honest, which is that I spend a lot of my time sorting and trying to organize, you know, the faces and personalities and character and presence and soul of people I will never see again, and scenes and places I will never see again, without making them into sort of like nostalgic baubles, and also trying to be present and alive to new things. There's something about having moved into a more reflective stage of life that I think maybe has something to do with this, with some desire to I don't know, apprehend grace.
I certainly relate to that. I feel like I spent the first part of my life manically going around collecting stuff, experience, whatever, links. And now I have as much stuff as I could ever handle or process. And I really recognize that wish to sift through it and to kind of contemplate it. I mean, I understand that, there are many things and I will never be again, places I will never be, people I will never see. That's a um yeah, I suppose an essay collection like this is a venue to begin that kind of work. And I mean, so far we've talked about it as if it's all personal, but there's another dimension to your writing that I always find, which is I always learn a lot from you in a kind of nerdy stuff to go and read, stuff to go and watch kind of way. Like I shamelessly track down your references. I watch things that you mention. I mean, you're the person who taught me to say Duras with an S, sounding the S. Um, and I mean, yeah, I mean, I spent the other night in front of Stranded in Canton, the Eggleston movie, and it was odd 'cause very recently I watched Wanda, the Barbara Loden movie. That's another kind of touchstone of you. But over the years, you've done this for me so many times, and it's one of the things that I love about your work is this kind of about a lot of cool shit that I want to know about. So you write a lot about art, and I think you're one of the minority of literary writers who has a really intense engagement with the art world. and that obviously that informed flamethrowers a lot. And one of the a fun essay in this book is an essay that is based around images, a kind of collection of images that you used as starting points or touchstones for that book. Yeah, because so could you say a little bit about that and how it feels to work with pictures rather than just going all out with your style as a writer?
Yeah. I think I actually have always sort of combined a relationship with pictures with writing. Like very early on, some of the first short stories that I wrote just as exercises when I was trying to figure out how to make a narrative that has a beginning, middle, and end. We're looking at these photographs by William Gedney. I don't know if you know that
Mm,
photographer. He's dead, but
another one.
he went down to Kentucky in the 1960s and took pictures of people working on cars. And I love those pictures, and they reminded me of my childhood. I guess watching people work on cars. I was always interested in that world, in cars and car culture, ever since I was very young. But there's something about looking at a picture that's a tableau that's mute. Also, Danny Lyon, the photographer, I would look at his photos a lot and think about like how could you make a story out of this? Are these characters that I can sort of take from this surface and deposit into a more dynamic space? So it was sort of it was like an exercise that I practiced when I was trying to teach myself how to write. Um, and then when I was working on the flamethrowers, I put these images up on the wall, and I always start a novel with some kind of image. But in that case, I had been writing about contemporary art, just doing these like occasional pieces, mostly for Art Forum, for years, and also socializing in the art world. For whatever reason, uh, most of my friends in New York, when I lived there, were artists, almost all of them. And so I felt like I got to see the way that artists perform their personality on other people, and came to read that as a component of their work, whether they're a performance artist or not. The way that people operate in a social space is like kind of big part of who they are. And there's some of the people that I met in New York had been, the sort of ascendant personalities in the 70s, which was the time that I was writing about. So I kind of wanted to pay homage to what I understood of the art world, and especially some of its more humorous components. I feel like art is really like the art world itself as one thing, a discourse and a set of personalities. It's always changing, it's a pretty ruthless world. There's a lot of like real money at play. Um, and people kind of have to brand themselves now, which is appalling and vulgar, but it's part of what's interesting about it. And what was I going to say about that? Um, I felt like I could always like learn something from that world, and I wanted to pay homage to it in the form of a book, especially the people from the 70s. Like, and I have an aunt who's an artist and who was, you know, she was one of the people who filmed the splitting of the house in New Jersey that by the famous work by Gordon Matta Clark. And she had brought my three cousins, who I grew up, still I'm very close to. She brought them to that project while they were splitting the house, and she was filming it. And incidentally, at that time, she was going through a divorce from her ex, who's a composer. And the kids saw Gordon Matta Clark sawing a house in half while their parents were splitting up, and they said, "No, do not cut that house in half." So I got exposed to these sort of tidbits that allowed me to contextualize some of these key moments in the 70s. And that was part of what led to writing that novel.
In a slightly tangential way, and I mean, you're very good at choosing the image or whatever that will be kind of key to larger things. And you pointed somewhere in the book, you pointed towards this short video of 70s Jeff Koons interviewing David Byrne, and it's such a fascinating document because I think I'd always seen Jeff Koons and his full flourishing as the the creature of the market, the Kunz we know, this sort of timeless, slightly sort of plastinated character with his atelier, and to see this earlier, slightly less worked out version of him with his, I don't know, he looks, I don't know, yeah, he looks like the kind of coke and disco guy who's sort of trying to have a conversation with, awkward, more downtown David Byrne. It opened up a lot about how you become, how he became Coons, and you use that very cleverly to talk about things to do with the market. This is not a question; it's just a compliment, really. Um, but another sort of dimension of the book is your engagement with Italy and Italian politics, and again the 70s and autonomia. So there's two prongs to the question I'd like to ask: is one, how did the engagement with Italy come about? And secondly, what does that 70s political moment of autonomia mean to you, and what could it mean to us to think about that now?
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll start with Coons, but I will connect him to Italy, except to a stream of Italian culture that comes just after the 1970s, which is the early 1980s, a kind of more reactionary, materialistic space. And that was the time when he met Cicciolina, who was Jeff Koons' wife, Italian porn star, and they made this series of works together. And I just, when you were talking about, there's a kind of more sleazy Jeff Koons who interviews David Byrne, and I write about it in the book. And yeah, he's not yet wearing a suit, looking like his eyes are open a little too wide, and he's getting ready to sit down to eat a bowl of cereal. You know, he says, happiness for me is a full box of cereal and a whole carton of milk. Um, but so, and this early video kind of complicates that. He's got a mustache, he's kind of greasy, and he talks like this. You know, he says, "Where I come from, they only have middle class bars." But then there's this kind of midway Jeff Koons before the populist booster, which is this series that he did with Cicciolina, which really he used her porn set as his own ready-made, but the artistic vision of it is her own, and she should be credited for it. But what Koons does, it actually is really weird. I don't know if you've seen those images. They're
I
all
have. I think they were the first work of his that I saw, like in all of these kind of classical poses, but with a very sort of explicit aspect, and it's very hyper real. Kind of the colors are all bumped up, and
right.
everything's super artificial.
But what's most real and unsettling about it is that, so okay, not that I need to tell a man how pornography works, but if we can define pornography as a space that you project yourself into, there's a blankness to it. You know, speaking of ready-mades, like, you're not thinking about the male. If you're a man looking at pornography, you're not thinking about, oh, there's Jeff Koons. You know, I'm watching Jeff Koons do this to this woman. No, you know, you're in some other space that you can project into. But Jeff Koons looks out into the eye of the camera in every single one of those pictures. And it, in a way, is deeply, you know, it's a, it's, it's totally perverse.
It
Um,
troubles all the categories, doesn't it?
Say it again.
It troubles all the categories. It kind of it crosses various lines in an
Yeah.
interesting way. I mean, I don't know whether I like the work, but I think it's certainly some of the work that makes me think much more than, I don't know, the balloon dogs or whatever.
I mean, I think it's deeply funny in a way that he probably will never cop to, because he's going, "Hi, I'm Jeff Koons. You know, welcome to my theme park of
Mm.
screwing." Um, it's kind of amazing. Anyway, so but back to Italy in the 1970s. So, um, so autonomia, I actually sort of got introduced to by my husband, who had been a student of Michael Hart when he was in college, who, you know, kind of famously wrote a series of books with Tony Negri. And I hadn't known anything about that world, but I'd spent time in Italy. I sort of speak Italian. I'm bad with languages, but if I speak one foreign language, it's that. And I had lived there when I was 18. And I went with Jason, who you know, my husband, and was introduced via him to both people who theorize and write about the politics of the 1970s, people who lived through that time and are of that generation, and also through him got connected to somebody who was connected to somebody who was basically a third wave Red Brigades terrorist who's in prison at the time when I met his girlfriend. And people would share stories with me about the 1970s in Italy, the early stories of the wildcat strikes at Fiat in the north, and then these later, more kind of like mass demonstrations in the streets of the late 70s. And there's a lot of nuance there in terms of what people are willing to share, what they're willing to make explicit about that time. And I realized I had kind of unusual access to the more anecdotal, richness, which is the territory for the novelist. And it seemed like everything I was hearing about was sort of temporally parallel to what was going on in New York. It's not really connected. It's just connected through my book. But in both cases, I was able to weave strands through that were kind of, I guess, if I had to summarize, about the violence of modernism, and this kind of factory violence, that is on the part of factory bosses and these Italian companies. It's a fictitious company, Moto Valera, but just the way that they conducted themselves and the connection between the piecework that was done all over the north of Italy for these motorcycle companies, and the time and the revolts. I think it's Tony Negri at one point in an interview says, you have to understand that, by 1969, Italy was making the fastest motorcycles in the world. I mean, a few years later, that wasn't true at all. But at that time, it's historically significant and politically significant.
I mean, yeah, I'm very tempted to head down a kind of a Nanny Balestrini uh, path, but I'm aware that I've taken up lots of time, and I should probably open things up to other people to ask questions. There's at least one question in the Q&A, but maybe Chelsea come back and do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we've got a question from Bob, who says, you've both written politically charged, socially aware novels, books that reflect the times. What's the trick to making art from the mess we're in, as we survive a pandemic and Trump, police killings, children in cages, mass incarceration, new Nazis, voter suppression, and a long overdue reckoning on race, without being heavy-handed or didactic and still being enjoyable to read?
Um, it presupposes that I've managed to do that. Rachel, what do you think
Me
about art
first.
and politics? Oh, yeah, go on. It's
I
your
think
gig.
Bob has his question game down. I just want to say, this is a very, very well formulated, well written question. Difficult one to answer. I'll probably be reframing what my answer would be for 10 days. So, thanks for keeping me up at night, Bob. But no, what I thought of immediately is the ways in which all of those things that you enumerate have very deep and complicated underpinnings that aren't new. Um, and maybe being mindful of presenting as a writer an account that draws from the long view of history, um, rather than seeing things as sudden. It's really hard to write a contemporary novel, I think. I mean, the challenge of it is fun, but the thing that I sometimes had to remind myself when I was writing The Mars Room is not when I was writing in order to write it, but I would just step back and say, the present is also a historical space. It just hasn't passed yet. But one will later be able to contextualize it and place it, and maybe to some degree account for certain aspects of it in exactly the same ways. I mean, for different causes, but with as much amplitude and understanding as we will other times in the past, except that in the present, less of that can be seen. And I'm always looking to try to see as much as I can about what's historical in the now.
I mean, I guess you could call that a sort of systems perspective, or a perspective that in some way goes beyond the personal. I don't know. I think that's a fantastic answer, and I mean, I could add that, you know, the novel doesn't thrive on as a form that just codes positions and uses characters as carry positions. If I want to make an argument, I tend to write an essay, or it's rant on the internet. Um, but the novel works for me as a space in which you can kind of enact tensions and ambiguities about these things. And I like writing situations which stage complexities rather than offer answers, maybe. And I think it is important to, I mean, for me to try and be an engaged writer, and I mean that's a sort of, in some ways, an old fashioned notion of what a writer can be. I mean, we're supposed to be these kind of entrepreneurs of self, much in the way that the artist Rachel mentioned are supposed to be. I mean, I think, it is one of our duties, if you think of writers as having duties, as to try and grapple with these difficult things, and to make them visible, to bring them forward as uh, possible subjects for yeah, to make them into history, to help them become historically visible. Okay. Another one from
Yeah.
Rupert Newton.
I just want to add that Hari's answer is my answer too. Because I agree with that completely. I mean, and obviously, yeah, I like the novel is not a space to make a political argument, which is why I make mine more in a more nonfiction reported manner. But sorry, next question.
Rupert says thank you both for the illuminating talk, and asks, do you find yourself getting tougher or harder with lived experience? Does this create a clash within? How do you deal with it? And I think this connects sort of with Hari's statement about being an engaged writer. Does that get more difficult, or?
Do you like tougher, harder? In I'm just trying to figure out in what regard, like more cynical.
Eh, maybe. I think it could be interpreted that way. Rupert, any follow up?
I definitely think about. I don't know if this is what he's referring to, but I look to older friends of mine and sort of try to figure out how they deflect cynicism and avoid becoming cynical. But personally, I don't feel tougher now. I mean, kind of quite the opposite. Um, I live a pretty soft, quiet life that I did not used to live. Um, so
Can I jump in and ask you a sort of
please.
corollary question? And I mean, obviously, a lot of the essays are about your 20s, when you were, there's a lot of risk that you. I mean, you seem to be interested in risk, and like, I mean, anybody who's driving a motorbike at 130 miles an hour down potholed Mexican roads is looking for something like. I mean, so what happened to that? Where do you put that energy now? I mean, is it just that you're older and you don't need that, or you have a different perception of risk because you have your mom, and you have investments in the world which make that different for you, or is there still some kind of outlet you have for your actual or metaphorical need for speed?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think of myself as someone who has a need for speed, but I definitely am starting to get this question now that this book is coming out. Um, some of it could just be boring, old-fashioned maturity. You get to a point where, like we were talking earlier about not really needing to embody the present anymore. But I don't know if some of the things that I've engaged in, like motorcycle racing, I don't know if it was about risk as much as the decisions that I made when I was younger. Some of them were characterized by a common theme in my life when I was young, which I think I would describe as being somebody who really wanted to be subjected to worlds and wanted to be subjected to worlds that were deeply encoded and could not be apprehended by staying home and reading books and had to be experienced, and I liked in a way being schooled by worlds, even working in a Tenderloin bar in the morning. I mean, I needed a job, and there was a global recession at that time, but I also didn't want a regular job. But working in a bar, I was the dumbest person in the room in a way because I didn't know the codes of that space. And I think I've always been somebody who wants to be taught. Um, the world of motorcycles, maybe that does kind of have to do with speed a bit. And I am a former ski racer. And so that's an outlet and allows for a level of aggression that it's actually kind of a higher level than I ever got to as a motorcyclist because I've been doing it my whole life, skiing, and I didn't learn to ride a motorcycle till I was 22. And to really, really push the envelope with bikes, I think you have to have ridden dirt bikes when you were a kid so that you can crash a lot in a safe environment and figure out exactly where the line is for you, like, how to handle cornering and acceleration and all that. But I kind of have that skill set in another realm, and maybe that's one outlet.
See, Shane asks, do you think it'll be challenging for writers of the future documenting today with the way social media is challenging or altering our notion of memory, storing photos and notes and reminding us daily of them? Living on the fringes of subculture in the 1980s and early 1990s, I and many from that time have plenty of memories, but very few photos to back up or challenge the memory.
That's kind of interesting. I mean, the lack of photos is definitely has some effect on that past, and in a way, it makes it it glows in a different way. Um, it's also going to be more malleable since there are less evidentiary traces that people can use. And in a sense, I might be grateful for that. Um, the fixity of all the photos is a little terrifying. I don't have a judgment of it at all. It just is what it is. I'm not somebody who kind of holds on to the past and compares it to the present as being objectively any one way better or worse. Often it's worse in certain ways. But the photo thing, I think it's useful for the writer in a way to be able to hold on to your own images and not have them be replaced by something that is meant to be the objective proof of the thing and what it actually looked like. I don't know, Hari, what do you think?
Um, I mean, I use photos. I take a lot of photos, and I use photos for work. I'm always pleased to find images of things that I'm trying to write about and think about. Often boring pictures. Like, I mean, the most useful things I do is sort of take pictures of street lamps and how the sidewalk looks in a particular place that I need to write about, rather than uh, you know stage kind of memories or whatever. But I mean, I wonder whether some idea of representation is getting very intense these days. I mean, I notice a lot of writers writing about photographs or about images and kind of placing their work in a sort of secondary way to some corpus of images or to some, I mean, maybe even social media posts or whatever. And whether that, I mean, I don't think that necessarily limits the scope of writing in any way, but it puts it in a maybe a secondary position to some supposedly indexical photo. And of course, at this point, we're just at the point where the idea of the photo as a trace of the real is collapsing completely. I mean, vision isn't even human vision anymore. So maybe that means it all doesn't matter. We're going to be living in a world of images, and their kind of relationship to truth will, that kind of very 20th century notion won't really hold anymore.
Thank you both so much. I think that's about all the time we have for questions, but thank you, Rachel and Hari, for this really insightful, wonderful conversation. And thank you to everyone who came out tonight and shared this space with us. A reminder, you can buy The Hard Crowd from Greenlight Bookstore. I'm dropping that link in the chat. You can buy it online from greenlightbookstore.com for either local pickup if you're in Brooklyn, or for shipping anywhere within US. Or if you're in Brooklyn, you can shop in our stores, limited capacity, from noon to 7 p.m. any day of the week. You can get the red pill too. Rachel is very kindly holding those both up for us.
The red
Take
pill
your
is great.
screenshots now.
I just read it recently, and it is so great, and it's so funny, and so weird, and so smart. It's a masterpiece. And listen to Hari's podcast, Into the Zone. Thank you, Chelsea. And Hari, thank you so much for doing this, and thanks
Always
everybody for coming.
lovely to see you. Yeah, thank you, Chelsea. Thanks everybody for turning up.
I'm also dropping a link in here to the event page where you can find both Rachel and Hari's books. So you can buy those also for pickup, shipping, whichever you like. Thank you so much again, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your evenings.
Good night.